Great. So we are talking heat experiences today. I am going to start by giving you just a quick definition and a story, and then we're going to go in breakouts. What is a heat experience? What do we mean when we talk about this? Now, the first time I came across the idea of, or the specific terminology of heat experiences was when I was reading one of Nick Petrie's white papers, making use of this term. And he said that in order for us to support vertical development or maturation, we need three things. We need heat experiences, we need colliding perspectives, and we need elevated sense making. And he said, when you bring those three together, it supports stage change or maturation. So in going a little, I forgot already, I wanted us to do a heat experience first, but let me maybe just give you some definitions. So this is from Nick Petrie's blogs. And he says, you're in a heat experience, and you don't need all 5 of these to be ticked, but maybe if 2 or 3 of them are ticked, it's probably a heat experience. If it's something you're doing for the first time, if results really, really matter, if there is a chance of success and failure, so success is not guaranteed, when important people are watching, and when you're experiencing discomfort, and it's extremely uncomfortable. So those things are what make a heat experience. Then the 2 things that I wanted to share. The one is a story from mythology, and that is the story in Greek mythology of Prometheus. Now, Prometheus was known as the person who went and stole fire from Zeus and brought it back to the humans on Earth. And from that fire, pretty much a lot of creativity and human civilization is said to have been born. So if Prometheus had not done that, the sciences, the arts, a lot of those kinds of things, people say Prometheus is in part behind it. In response to Prometheus doing this, 2 curious things happened. The first is that Pandora was also sent by Zeus to Earth. And of course, you know what happened when Pandora's box got opened, all of disease and, a whole lot of terrible things came onto the planet because Pandora's box got opened. The other thing is Zeus and the Greek gods were not necessarily all kindly gods. So Zeus got very upset with Prometheus for a number of different reasons, and he had Prometheus chained, and every day this giant eagle, which is in part a symbol of Zeus, would come and he would eat Prometheus's liver, and during the night the liver would regenerate, and the next day that liver would get eaten again, over and over and over again. So when we're talking about heat, it's something that has great creative potential. It can give birth to a lot of amazing things. We could also be opening Pandora's box, and we could also, in some way, suffer as a result of it, have our livers eaten over and over and over again. So when we work with heat experiences, we need to do so knowing that we are in an interesting territory. Yeah, it's not just let's bring heat, everything's going to be nice and we're all going to grow and develop. It's quite significant what it entails. Okay, so those are my opening stories. We are now going to have an opening practice, and then we will have our check-ins in our small groups as we normally do here. So the practice that I want to introduce to you today, some of you may be familiar with it, is called Tummo breathing. So Tummo breathing is a Buddhist breathing practice. It is mostly made famous by a very extreme person called Wim Hof, who uses this as one of his breathing practices that enables him to swim in the snow or whatever it is that he does. Crazy man. But it has much more ancient roots than Wim Hof's work. So if you're in a car or driving somewhere, I don't know where Henriette and Kristen are, please don't do this practice with us. It can create lightheadedness. You need to be sitting down for it. And it's one of the ways in which you can invite a little bit of fire into your own body. So it's a high energy practice. You can, it's probably best if you guys keep yourselves muted for this. And what I'm going to invite you to do, I'll first describe the practice, and then I'm going to just invite one round of breathing. If you want to do this by yourself, normally you do between 3 to 5 rounds of it. So the core of Tumo breathing is you start by breathing in, and you breathe in through your mouth, and you breathe in quite a lot of air, yeah? So it's a deep, full breath through your nose and your mouth. My nose is quite blocked. For a lot of breathing practices, you use your nose. This one, you use your mouth as well. And then you just let your breath go. You don't try and empty your lungs at the end of it. You just let it go. And then you do another big inhalation through your nose, and we will do 30 breaths. So you can do between 30 and 40 breaths, more or less. I'll keep count. So we'll do roughly that. And so you are in some way supporting a kind of slight hyperventilation. If you feel some tingling or some interesting physical experiences, just take note of it. It doesn't mean that you're doing something wrong. And then at the end of this 30 rounds of breathing in, what we're going to do is we're going to breathe out, and then we're going to hold our out breath. So hold on empty lungs. And then when you're ready, and for most people, our carbon dioxide tolerance is not that great. So, you know, please don't hold it until you pass out. But when you feel you've held it long enough, take a slow, full in-breath, and then hold your in-breath for about 15 seconds, and then just breathe out normally. Okay, so 30 breaths, and it's like, that's more or less what it sounds like. So I'm breathing in more, and I'm just letting the out breath go. And I will count roughly on my fingers, so you'll see when we get to 30, and then we stop on the out breath, hold the out breath, breathe in slowly, hold the in breath for roughly 15 seconds, and then go back to a normal breath. So this is called fire breath. Yeah, so we're all in the heat experience territory. Okay, so when you are ready, just sit comfortably. If you are driving, Miriam, you're not allowed to do this. If you're driving, please. It can create accidents and lightheadedness. So you are just...
I'm parked.
You parked?
I'm in the car, but I'm parked.
Okay, as long as you parked, you're allowed to participate. There we go. Okay, so let's get started. So breathe in. Hold your out breath. Keep it out. Whenever you're ready, remember the next step will be to breathe in and hold your in breath. And just count for yourself on the in breath, roughly 15 seconds. And when you are ready, you can return to normal breath. Just taking note of what's happening in your body, what you're feeling, what this experience is like. Maybe we can hear from 1 or 2 people. Anything you've noticed, either through just doing the practice in front of other people, or a physical sensation in the body, or maybe even a mental or emotional sensation. Let's just hear 1 or 2 people. What was that? Tumo breathing. like for you? And I'm interested in terms of people who may be doing this for the first time. We said that's something that creates a heat experience. You're doing things for the first time.
I can share something, Lucille.
Thanks, Duncan.
I think the most interesting part is when you hold the breath at the end, because it's almost this intense duality of peace and stillness, but also still from the breathing, a lot of energy moving, like things moving within you. So it's stillness and heat at the same time.
Yeah. How beautiful is that? It's interesting. Sometimes it's stillness. Sometimes it can even evoke quite a bit of anxiety. One of the interesting definitions of what is resilience is that resilience is our capacity for carbon dioxide in our bodies. What an interesting thing to think about there. Anyone else that'd like to just say what that experience is like? Maybe just a show of hands. Who of you feel a little bit warmer on the inside? Okay. So it has created a little bit of heat for people. If you do 3 or 5 rounds, it creates quite a lot of heat. Yeah. Anyone else? Karen.
Yeah, I feel I'm not used to breathing in through my mouth. I normally always, and when I'm doing this with clients, always breathing in through the nose, hold the breath, and then out through the mouth. So this time, it's like contrary to what I normally do. And I felt like, we had to do it, like 30 breaths out. It felt like, it's like almost like I felt like a dragon, like with a hot breath of a dragon.
Beautiful. Thank you. Ooh, we've evoked some dragon inside Karen. Great. So we're in the territory of heat experiences. We've done a breath practice that evokes heat. And now we will go into just short breakouts to connect to our topic personally. And let me just pop some of the questions I'd like you to work with in the chat box. So the first is, what are examples of heat in my one-on-one coaching work? And if you do group work, what are some examples of heat in your group work? And then to think a little bit more, what is your relationship with heat? Especially your relationship with heat in your in the client practitioner relationship. Yeah. So what are examples of heat in my one-on-one coaching work? What are examples of heat in my group work if I do that? What is my own relationship with heat in the client practitioner relationship? And we'll just do 15 minutes of breakout around that. Maybe just before we do that, for those of you that came in late, there are many definitions of what is a heat experience. This is one from Nick Petrie, and he says a heat experience doesn't have to be all 5 of these, but probably 2 or 3 of these would make a heat experience. It's a first time thing, results matter. You may succeed or fail. Important people are watching, and it's uncomfortable. So that's a definition of that. As always, I will share the slides afterwards, just as a thought for everyone. Okay, so let's do breakout rooms and see you back here in 15 minutes. Apologies for the Zoom whiplash. Let's get a couple of thoughts into the big room. Anything that you'd like to share that felt like an important pattern, or something interesting that you'd like to share in the broader group around heat in coaching, heat in group work, and your own relationship with heat as you work as a practitioner in that relationship?
So Lucille, something that came up in our discussion, and which has also been on the Enneagram group a little bit, and that is around how our instincts stack and how your blind instinct can potentially lead into a heat experience or create a heat experience. So we were talking about one-on-one work versus group work, and we said, we were looking at Enneagram types and subtypes or instincts. and how that could potentially impact where one felt more discomfort, you know, like social and one-on-one, and how one-on-one or somebody who is one-on-one blind might feel more comfortable in a group setting or vice versa.
Interesting. I've been following the discussion in the Enneagram chat group quite a bit around this idea of the instincts. And yeah, there's different strands to this. Let me maybe just say one or two things. In my perspective, the instincts are there to try and help us respond to heat. Yeah. So if the instincts are survival mechanisms, they are activated when my survival is threatened, which is one way of thinking about a kind of heat experience. And so then they try and come to my rescue. And the order in which I deploy the armies has a lot to do with my instinct stacking. And there are interesting things that happen when I have to deploy an instinct that I am a little bit blind to. So I don't have as strong neural pathways for that. So yeah, it's an interesting connection between the question and that. And, you know, that was the talk that Ingrid and I recently did, was about heat in the Enneagram specifically. Today, we're talking a bit more generically around that. Anyone else who'd like to offer an observation, Enneagram or otherwise related?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay. My experience is if there's no heat somewhere in the session, there is no development. There's no, and it's kind of like, I might as well have just had a conversation with my friend or whatever it is. It's like, my intention is to cause that heat. And it'll go up and down depending on who and what I work with. And so,
yeah, and so a follow-up question for you, Miriam. How do you know that there is heat in the session? What tells you that there's heat in the session?
How a person reacts, their change in their facial, their body, their neck, forward, backwards. So this whole aura, and also their voice. And usually they'll kind of go, oh, there's this aha, but it's not just aha. It's like this aha. I can't explain it other than that.
Yeah.
And I reflect on my sessions saying, geez, was that a good one? Or, you know, did we impact? And that's how I look at it. Was there a good, was there some impact that occurred? There was something that shifted.
Beautiful. Thank you. So interesting things. There are a lot of the reading the heat in the session. So in some way, it's like the purpose of coaching is potentially to create some heat or to process heat. It's one way of reframing it. And then how do we know that there's heat in the session? So the first is the body tells us a lot. Then, of course, the impact. Then the verbals can tell us a lot as well. And there's the neural, the mirroring process. If we're really attuned and present, if I can feel the heat as the coach, then that's possibly because of the mirror neurons telling me that there's something happening for my clients. And sometimes I might be experiencing heat because it's my heat in some way as the coach as well. I'm doing something out of my comfort zone, which might be to challenge a client or to ask a question or to ask for feedback about the coaching itself, to work in the here and now. If I don't do that a lot in my coaching, then that can be quite an edge for me to cross as well. So I'm going to offer a little bit of just a couple of inputs, and we'll hear from Alistair before I do that. And then what we'll do is we'll stop again and talk about it some more and maybe bring in some of your cases. Alistair.
Hi, thanks. So I was just sharing in the group before we got cut off. And the way I kind of understand this heat experience stuff is it's more around what you are doing. And before I share my story, I'm just curious. I just got this question, like, how much power or influence do we have as coaches to manufacture heat? Because when I look at some people that I know who've like probably gone up the vertical development scale, they went through some pain, like some serious loss. And it's like, could be a divorce, but it's like a nasty, nasty divorce or loss of a loved one or something nasty. And they kind of recovered from that. So it's not something you can manufacture in like a boardroom, you know, with those people that I know intimately, right? But anyway, so in my personal story, it's like, as you know, when I got assessed on the AIM, Euphoria's AIM, I came out on specialized, right? And that was the time I was transitioning from being an accountant and becoming a coach, right? And transitioning from employment to running my own practice. So the comfort of a salary every month is not guaranteed, right? So for me, the past 2 years has been a lot of heat, right? And coming from a very technical background, I find myself sometimes trying to teach a client the model and not coach the model, even in a sales pitch. So it's very hard for me to not teach. Sometimes I just need to, I know I've got sales I've lost, I could not close because I kept on teaching, trying to prove that I know I'm worthy and all that stuff. But the client was already sold. And then, so it's like, I now have to shift from my old way of thinking and grow to the performing where the metric is there. I need to make money. I need to create success for my clients. And that's how I define my life right now. It's like, has my client been successful? If the answer is no, then I'm not performing. If I'm not generating income, I'm going to be out of business. So, and I hang out with my peeps from back in the finance world, and I'm kind of seeing like, yeah, some of them get coaching, but they're comfortable. You know, the career path is set, the bonus, you know, Feb, March is bonus month. You know, there's so much they can do. And yeah, and I'm like, there's no heat. So I think the coaching space, the other two elements of Nick, according to Nick, of how to develop people vertically, the elevated sense making is there. And the other one, forgot what it is now. Colliding perspective. But the heat, I think heat has to come from real life experiences. And that's what's kept me going in the tough times. Oh, dude, it's tough, but it's a heat experience. That's the journey if you want to develop vertically. So long story, but that's my current understanding of the stuff.
Beautiful, beautiful, Alistair. There's so much in there that one can unpack. And I think that is maybe a nice segue into just the core of what Nick's white paper says there is he says that for vertical development, you need all three elements to be present. You need the heat and the colliding perspectives and the elevated sense making. So let's talk about it in more everyday language. You need some discomfort. In that space of discomfort, you need to bring in new ideas, different ways of doing things, new approaches, new possibilities. So that would be your colliding perspectives. And often people can bring that in. So the coach would be one person that could bring that in. A colleague could bring that in, a lot of other things. And then I need space to reflect and integrate. So what happens, for example, if I have a lot of new ideas coming my way, and I have space to reflect, but I've no heat. That's something that Alistair experiences in some of his colleagues that are still in corporate. Without the heat, it's often I miss the energy to actually do something with it. There's no burning platform. There's no reason to actually apply all of this because what I've got is working fairly well. Or if I've got a lot of heat and I have got space to reflect, but there are no new ideas that come through, that can create quite a tense stuckness because, you know, things aren't working. I'm reflecting on it. I'm aware of it, but I'm stuck. I don't know what to do with it. I don't know how to move from here. So we need in some way this combination to help us get into the space. And I love what you said around manufacturing heat versus naturally occurring heat, because that is one of the distinctions that I would make. When we have natural heat, there are experiences that are naturally bringing the heat to the client. And this might be a point in time where they even choose coaching. The company's not performing well, so the CEO goes, okay, let me go think this through. Or I've transitioned from my safe corporate job into coaching, and I've given up all of the security of the paycheck, and I can feel the heat, and so it's naturally there. Or I've lost a loved one, or I'm struggling with things in my personal relationship, or the thing people get tired of hearing me say, we are raising teenagers. You raise a 17-year-old young man, there's a lot of heat. Whether you go look for it or not, it's there, right? So there's naturally occurring heat. When there's naturally occurring heat and a person comes to you for coaching, your role is more in the elevated sense making and the colliding perspectives, creating space for reflection, time to think. Coaching does that quite naturally. And then there is the way in which we bring alternative ways of seeing and doing and being into conversation with that, so that we don't have a stuck client. What happens when there is no heat? What are the ethics around manufacturing heat? Can you, in fact, manufacture heat? So in the one-on-one coaching situation, I know that one of the best ways to manufacture heat is to coach in the here and now. If the client is talking a lot and never gives me space as a coach, it's that moment where I go, can I give you a little bit of my experience when we're in this pattern? And all of a sudden there's heat in it because I'm not allowing the script of the client to run just full steam. Or maybe saying something more challenging, or helping people see a defense mechanism or something around the instincts. There's lots that we can do, or bringing in something like a vertical development framework. A maturity assessment can bring in heat in a system that needs heat. Because all of a sudden I get some feedback that there are other stages, and so that's one way of bringing in heat into that space. In group work, we can also manufacture heat. And there's a lot of learning and development theory around that. It might be called a lot of different things, but that idea of creating some exposure that's new or unusual, it can be in the form of role plays, it can be experiences, it can be simulations. There's a whole lot of things that we could do there that brings heat into the group. And I know that there are some of you here in this room that have done some really interesting things to bring heat into a room. So we'll think about that as well. Now, the core thing that comes from manufacturing or introducing heat is that we are in the territory where we need to, in some way, create something that's enough heat, but not too much heat, right? So if there's too little heat, I'm bored, I'm confident, I'm in my groove, I'm comfortable, It's another way of doing that. So if the coaching is not challenging at all, and we never have that moment that Miriam referred to where the client goes, oh, wow, let me just take a breath. Let me process this. What does this mean? How do we work with this? If we don't have any of those moments, well, maybe we're not going to keep our coaching clients that long. They'll be bored. It's not going to add value to them. Then there is the space where we've got a good level of discomfort, which optimizes how much learning I can get from that. What happens if I get more heat going? The neuroscience of too much heat says that then we push people into fight or flight. Yes, and when people are in fight or flight, I'm not learning, I'm not taking new information in. My nervous system is not wired to be curious, open, and to move towards that. So if I'm introducing heat, I am in some way having to track the nervous system of my client very carefully. And I need different techniques that helps me to regulate when we might just push a little bit too far, because we will inevitably at times. You know, if I'm open to experimentation, introducing heat, there's no guarantee that I will get it 100% right. Yeah. So I need some somatic techniques. It's basically the starting point of it. And one of the most powerful ways to bring in somatic techniques is, and some of you may have some great practices around that, but breath work is one that I'm starting to work with quite a lot. And even just doing something as simple as having a nice big breath in through the nose and a sigh, that actually starts to calm the nervous system down. Or slowing the out breath. If I'm breathing in 3 counts, then I breathe out for 6 counts. So I might need breath work. I might need some other things, some mindfulness practice, some presencing practices that help me to be in relationship with the nervous system of the clients that I'm working with. The second thing that's really important is that I need to be able to read the context and how much heat is in the context already. If I have water that's already boiling and I add more heat to that, it's very quick that spins into actually a traumatizing experience. And we might have clients that are already in a place where they are in crisis. The time to be in crisis is not the time to go and add a whole lot of heat. And people that do crisis counseling, etc., would tell you that when a person is in active crisis, coaching in and of itself is also not very useful, because that's when I go from non-directive coaching kind of practices into very directive space. Make it safe. How are you going to get support? What are you going to do in this moment? So it's not a time to be adding more heat. You actually want to actively activate some things. So yeah, we're in curious territory. We need to understand the context. If we don't understand our clients in context, we're going to misread how much heat is already there. And we might be working with executives that are quite well guarded, just as an example. Some people are very open about heat that's happening outside of the boundary of whatever they see as the context that they're going to share here with you as their coach. And some are not. Some are not. And you might think of Enneagram type, or you might think of a lot of other reasons why people might withhold context. Shame is a big reason why people might withhold context. Masking, wanting to look successful, fearing the rejection of the coach, not wanting to seem weak or vulnerable. There's not trusting you yet, like kind of testing you as the coach, being super private. There are many reasons why we might not share our context fully with our coaches, which then means that you have to be reading in the moment, whether this is too much heat, too little heat, the right amount of heat. And of course, getting direct feedback from your clients could be useful here too. I'll pause here for a moment and just go, what's come up for you? Any thoughts, any questions, any things that are stirring as you think about how you coach and how you work with heat, manufactured or the heat that's already there? Okay, so nothing coming up here yet. If you want to pop, Karen, please come in. Also, just note if you want to pop some thoughts into the chat box as we go along, that's also welcome. Karen.
Yeah, just to say that I tend to use somatic techniques quite a bit, like bringing in the breath work, exactly what you said, you know, the slower, like 3 counts or 4 counts to breathe in, hold the breath, and then double the amount of counts to breathe out. To calm the clients, so that when I notice that there's maybe too much heat, to basically take off the heat, to take the edge off. So I think what I'm trying to say is it's just noticing the client. You know, you said the coach must read the context, but also follow the client. It's the same sort of thing, and be where the client is at. So if there's too much heat, use the breath work to just remove a bit of heat.
So here's an interesting, you know, all of you know that know me by now, a little bit of trickster teaching. How does my own comfort with heat impact my reading of my client's nervous system? If I am, for example, an Enneagram 7, and I am in some way unconsciously avoiding pain, may I save my clients from heat prematurely? If I'm an Enneagram 4, that's quite into heat, might I in some way think that my clients can stand more heat than they can? And so I push them too far, too fast. And therefore I need to check my own assumptions and comfort on heat. If I'm an Enneagram 2 coach, maybe there's some ideas around not wanting to do things that in some way can make the client dislike me. So I you know, in some way I'm kinder and I bring less heat than I might. Yeah. So there's just a couple of thoughts also around my own relationship with heat that's very useful to keep in mind. And there's a lot of stuff happening there in the chat around thinking about asking clients around heat in the moment. Yeah. And even contracting up front around heat. How much heat do you want in this coaching situation? Let it not be my assumption. Tell me about how much heat you already have in your context. And will you give me feedback when you feel it's too heated in the session? So that's an upfront contracting piece that can be very useful. I love what Jill says as well around silence. Silence is one of the most everyday and powerful ways to increase heat. Yeah, just keeping quiet and allowing for the process to play out can naturally introduce a lot of heat, and at the same time silence can be time for reflection and calming down and allow the client to calm their own nervous system down. You'd have to read your client around that. So a couple of more thoughts around this. So when we look at some of the warning signs around when it's too much heat or too much heat in the context already. So when I'm working with individuals, it's about whether people are able to see options. If they can't see the options that are right there in front of them, maybe that's a sign that there's too much heat. When I'm not asking for help as a leader soon enough, too much heat, I'm kind of in that fight or flight space. Lack of empathy for others' emotions, poor listening. You know, so when my clients that I've been working with over time get into that space where they're more insistent or they fall back into old patterns and there's no time for reflection, there's too much going on and that plays out, then that might be a sign to process where the heat's coming from. When we're working with teams, interesting things there. When the team as a collective can't agree on which way to go next, when there's proven solutions that we're just throwing off the table, lots of effort, like headless chicken kind of effort with disappointing results. And when a lot of my energy starts going into power struggles, or where the feedback that that we're giving each other is not helpful feedback, but really criticism. And we just in that storming space. So there might be lots of other warning signals, but it's useful for a team to also, if I'm working with elevated sense making, I'm wanting teams to be able, or individuals to be able to read how much heat they're experiencing and whether it's too much and what kind of regulation might be required here. So there's some warning signs. That's all of this is from, it's not Nick Petrie's white paper, but there's a standard CCL white paper that is around heat experiences. So in that white paper, they talk about 3 levels of heat, which is quite curious. There's like 3 settings on your stovetop. Heat level 1 is when things are not that complex. I'm in known territory. If we bring Cynefin and Dave Snowden's work in here, these are the known knowns. There's a known problem, there's some known solutions, and there's low discomfort, there's some familiar change happening, and yet at the same time there is heat, right? I'm somehow not getting to those solutions, we're not working through it. It's not completely unfamiliar, but there is some heat in the system. Now, if we want to stimulate or create, manufacture that level of heat, often role plays are very useful. Yeah, it's not a massive amount of heat, it's a little bit of heat. So ways to stimulate that level of heat is role plays. And how often do we need to debrief? As it's needed, right? So the core principle that we get from this thought is that the more heat there is, the more I need to debrief and make space for that reflection piece, the elevated sense making. So level 1, if I feel there's a need to debrief, I can, and if not, then I can just move on. So that's level 1. Level 2 is when I have known problems, so familiar problems, and I don't know what the solutions are. Yeah. So there's some teams that maybe you are working with where they go, okay, here we are again. We're at the place where we've set super ambitious goals for the year and we're not meeting our targets. And we're starting to blame each other for the lack of delivery. Okay, we've been here before. This is a known problem. And somehow we haven't been able to find the solutions that get us to break this pattern yet. So this is a medium level of discomfort. And sometimes when we're doing things like scaling very fast or revising our operating model, that's naturally occurring versions of that in the system. And here the idea is that we don't want to work with tools, but we want to work with skills, yeah, or meta competencies. And there's more and more thought in the vertical development community that's going into these meta competency based thinking. What helps really well here, ways to stimulate this level of heat, is games and simulations. Yeah. So, or if I want to help a team that's in the space to work through possible different solution, simulations may be useful here. And how often do we debrief? Now, every time there's like a critical point in the process, I have to debrief, whether they want to or not, whether they say we're too busy to debrief or not. We have to enforce more debriefing or feedback reflection time. And then when we get to level 3 of heat, this is unknown problems. We don't even know what the problem is, and unknown solutions, lots of discomfort. For example, where we were at in the first, let's say, 6 months of COVID. So very high levels of discomfort inside businesses, inside families, inside homes. Here, what helps us to overcome the heat is not tools and skills. It's actually collective breakthroughs. It's like that generative reformatting inside the communal system that does this. And here, one of the ways to create this kind of heat is what we call offsite expeditions. And there's a consistent frequency. Now, in terms of this idea of offsite expeditions, 1 or 2 examples of that. One that I've used quite effectively is with a group of Xhosa women leaders that come from a cultural perspective where it is a very few Xhosa women have a loving relationship with the ocean. and with swimming. This is not where we go. That's culturally not part of their life. And we agree, and there's agreement in the group, there's permission in the group for all of us to try surfing together. Yep. So we did this with a group of women leaders. And we did this after we had already spent a day traveling to Steve Biko, who is a massive activist that died in the 70s and did a lot of Black consciousness work in South Africa. And we'd already traveled to Steve Biko's hometown, to Ginsberg, visited the Steve Biko Museum, spoke about his legacy, went to his grave and the ways in which he challenged the system. So we primed people to be ready for some challenge. They challenged themselves, they went surfing, and it was amazing what this did. So it was held, there was a lot of debriefing and impromptu debriefing as well. Even on the beach, there was one of the women in the group who took this massive longboard under her arm, walked into the ocean until she was in the ocean halfway, stood there for 5 minutes, turned around and walked back out again. And that was as much as she did. And that was more than enough, right? More than enough. It was beautiful. And then you had other people that experimented, and, you know, a lot of other things happened for them. There was a lot of debriefing around it. Really beautiful there. Another place where this happens is to take a team not just into an offsite, but maybe to take a team into a kind of vision fasting territory after working on a collective problem, and to have them go out into nature without tents, without food, just with water in a safe space, and to on the same 4 days work with the same kinds of questions, and then come back together and change the nature of that conversation. Some of the other things that I haven't done with people, but that people sometimes do, is to take an executive team and take them to go and learn sailing together as a group, and to do a collective sailing exercise. So, but you're out of your familiar territory. Can you see? It's not something that's happening in situ in the work environment. So that's one way of doing it. Somewhere in the in-between space, here in Cape Town, there's a wonderful place run by the Navy, where there's a simulation where you can go and, as a group, simulate being the crew on that's driving this, I don't even know the right terminology for this, sailing this massive big oil tanker into a harbor. And you've got all the controls, you don't know how any of that works. And then there's some crises that happen, pirates that jump onto the deck, and you have to, you know, fend them off. And it's a beautiful simulation, amazing use of technology. And you take people there after they've been on an executive MBA and learned all the theory on how to be great leaders. And guess what happens? We forget all that great theory very quickly. And often people come away from that saying, the most learning that I did was when I was in the simulator. Because it's a lot more felt and embodied and than the theory. Yeah, so there's an opportunity for that. And then you get people to debrief and do another simulation in the ship the second time round with more intentionality. And most of the time the groups do a much better job the second time round. And there's real possibility for failure, and there's great learning around it. So levels of heat, different things that we can do. And so this is some things people can think about. So there's this idea of games. Games get leaders to solve a unique challenge and offer practice hours, collaborating despite lots of unknowns. You know, and there's nice kind of what do you call them, icebreaker type exercises that can be games. You can have much more serious and deliberately designed games as well. And then simulations. So something that mirrors a real business reality, but it's not the real thing. So I can try something new, because often people feel that there's too much of a risk to try things new when it's live. And then the expeditions, it's the highest form of safe heat. that forces leaders to tackle very unfamiliar problems, and yeah, to build deep bonds. So games, simulations, expeditions are different ways of thinking about this. And this is then just a way of kind of summarizing that. If I'm in the known territory, so level 1 of heat, role plays will give me that level of heat, and then I can get to unfamiliar challenges. So that's games, or unknown solutions, that's simulations. The idea of learning labs often work with a simulation idea. And then there's the combination of the two when I take people into unknown worlds for them to work with unknown solutions, but in a space where it's safe enough to risk some things. So I'll pause there. Questions, comments, thoughts, what's coming up? Any experiences you've had around manufacturing heat that's worked really well? What level of heat do you think that was at? Any times when you've manufactured heat where it, maybe it didn't work as you planned that you'd like to think about? This is supervision, so it's a space where we can safely talk about our failings as well, and our lessons learned along the way. Anyone that would like to share, you can just unmute yourself.
I'm happy to share. Lucille, as you know, like I've been playing mostly in the space of of music and movement, and inviting people to dance, but rational IT people. And yeah, and it's been super interesting. And I think one of the things that stands out is you're really needing to set it up very clearly for people so that you access something that they are strong at. So it's not too much of a stretch. So with rational people, obviously bringing in what is the business case for this? What's the science behind it? Why are we doing it? So that there's more of a chance that they'll step into it. But then, when people step into it, to notice that some people actually, for some people, it's not too hectic and they can step in and quite enjoy it. But for others, that it actually tipped some of them out of the process. Yep. So it was, and that was quite a hard learning, to see that it can be quite traumatizing or overwhelming. So I think where the heat is pushed too far, and how do you find the right balance when you're working with a group of, in my case, it was 25 people initially, and then in the second case, it was 100 people,
wow.
And working with quite a spectrum of people.
Yeah. And so that's where it does get very tricky. So what feels fine for some people and is a good amount of heat when I'm working with a large group can be way too much for someone else. And what are my protocols for doing that? Anything you learned from that process that can be useful for everyone else when you're working with a large group where for some it's fine, and then for a couple of people it's pushed them too far? How, what are the lessons learned for you from that? If you had to do that again, how would you shift or change it, if at all?
I don't know, I think with 100 people, and especially in that particular scenario, I didn't know the 100 people. I knew 25 of the 100 people. So I didn't know whether it was going to tip people over. But I think one of the things, that we came up with in supervision was having more of a support structure for afterwards. So if anybody has been tipped over, that there's, there are those debrief places where people can feel safe and process. So I think that's a key thing. I'm super aware, following this conversation, of my Enneagram 4 tendency to let's do it, let's go for it. and that maybe, my tendency is to push people too hard, too far, too quickly. So that's another learning from today.
Useful. Thank you so much for sharing, Kate. I think a couple of thoughts around this. The one is, the larger the group, if you're introducing heat in a large group setting where as one facilitator, you can't stay attuned to everyone that's there. it is part of what creates safety is your co-facilitator process. And I know you had co-facilitators in that, but your co-facilitation alliance as well, and how strong that is. So if you have 3 people when working with a group of 100, then, you know, what are the roles for people to, what I always call patrol the boundaries of the process, and to support people that are there. So that's one thing to think about. I also sometimes love this. There's such cool ways of checking in with large groups that come from large room planning and different agile methodologies. So sometimes, you know, what is useful when you're wanting to introduce heat, before introducing heat, would go, how uncomfortable are you feeling now that we've described the activity we're going to do? And people can just do a vote with their hands. 5 out of 5 is I'm super freaked out. 1 out of 5, I'm really ready for it. You know, so there's ways in which one can quickly see how freaked out a group is, and then to ask a couple of people that are 5 out of 5, what do you need to say or request for this to feel safer for you? So we come down to a 4 or a 3. So that's one way of thinking about it.
Sorry, and the other thought that popped into my mind, Lucille, was to invite everybody to step into the discomfort if they are feeling discomfort, but to still make it voluntary. So for people who really like the woman who could only do 5 minutes in the seas, to make that absolutely fine.
Yeah.
No judgment, but yeah.
If only your toe wants to dance, stand in one spot and allow your toe to dance here. If that's how much heat, I love that idea. It's really beautiful, because that is part of the ethics of heat. If we think about the idea of being invitational and people being voluntary participation in these kinds of things is very different to forcing people into something. And when we force people into that, there's a power relationship that can be quite colonial. And so a decolonized mindset would always be to say, contract together, even design together where we can, but step in and step out, and to affirm the agency of people in relation to that, and to invite them to take on a bit more heat than they think they can. So it's like, it's a fine dancing line, and we need to understand that if we're going to force people into things, we're stepping into a specific power relationship that is problematic, potentially. Yeah. So Kate shared. Anyone else that wants to share, either in a group or in an individual coaching setting, anything that you've tried that's either worked or not worked, that can be a kind of learning share for people here? Okay, so let's keep thinking about this. We'll come back for some more thoughts and some cases and ideas here. I'll just share 1 or 2 more things. Yes. Yes.
Just an idea. I only have a sample of 1. My N is 1 here, and it's not even complete yet. But what I've noticed is, in every organization, there's always this one thing or more that people don't want to do. They, like when I was in my auditing days, there was something they would call like a box job.
Yes.
It's like this bunch of files in a box that's been there for years and nobody wants to touch it, you know. And I was just talking to a coaching colleague who's coaching in the government, and this group of senior people in the government don't want to be coached, but the budget is there, and my colleague got the tender and all that. And then I just proposed to her, like, find something that's already part of their plan, but they don't want to do it. And it's been sitting for years. So there were some performance appraisals that they needed to do that are now part of the plan again. So it's kind of giving, it's not like you, the outsider, suggesting this superheat experience.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, it's your plan, it's your box job. Let's do it. And then through my hope for her is through them doing that performance appraisal, then you can start to see who's not collaborating with who likes who, you know.
Yeah.
So we'll see. Maybe by the end of the year to be done.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that is one of the things that is really useful for a coach as well. When there's, you know, there's not much, it's not even heat, but there's not much, it feels like not much skin in the game when you're working with a group or with an individual, that this idea of ghosting or observing people while they work, and then to introduce different ways of making sense of that or different interpretations, you know, to what they maybe put into that meeting, but to watch people in their meetings, to watch them in their tasks, is a very interesting way of, it's not quite manufacturing heat, but showing, like making a little fire under what's already there. And I like that idea of the box jobs. You know, why are we avoiding the box jobs? I like that a lot. Thanks, Alistair. Yeah. So the core thing here then, and some of you have heard me say this before, when we're working with heat, we're not just working with disruption. We're also working with the containment and the reflection and the integration of that. So we want to disrupt and contain in a rhythm. And if we go back to this idea of 3 levels of heat, the more heat there is, so level 3, the debrief frequency, the reflection frequency increases, the more containment we need. We can't just have this big experience and then push them back into that without harvesting, reflecting, integrating, containing the learning that's come from that. So disruption and containment need to be in relationship with each other in these settings. So we've started to talk about the ethics of heat. And I guess 1 or 2 things that I'd add to this. So there's natural heat and manufactured heat. When there's natural heat occurring, often, and it's a lot of natural heat, it's often the ethics of this would say that it's not my job to add heat, because if I add heat to natural occurring heat that's there, I might create wildfires. And when I manufacture heat, I need to not have a colonial privileged mindset around that. I need to give people, I need to check the way I invite them into it. People need to choose to step into it. It needs to be with permission. We need to have contracted for it in a big way. Psychological safety and the level of psychological safety in a group is going to, in many ways, give you an idea of whether level 1, 2, or 3 of heat is appropriate here. So if there's very low levels of psychological safety, then level 1, maybe a little bit of level 2 heat is what you can work with. If you take a low psychological safety team into a group experience where there's a massive amount of heat, you often fragment them rather than bringing them together. And so that's like just a core thing. So sometimes the foundation for a heat experience, sometimes I need to contain before I disrupt. So what are my practices for checking psychological safety, developing psychological safety? The first thing that we do is not necessarily the scariest thing that we do. Yeah. And that's one of the ways in which I can be a trauma-informed practitioner in some way. Then we have started to speak about context, but context is a very interesting thing. Julia and I were recording a session for the IA conference that's coming up in San Francisco recently, last week. And we had this whole conversation around what is my context? As I'm sitting here, part of my context might be the pain that I have in my mouth after my dental surgery. It might be this table. It might be the weather outside. It might be my family system. It might be the fact that there's stage 6 rolling blackouts happening tonight here in our part of the world. That might be context. And maybe I'd been watching the news And so part of whatever was on that international news program, is that part of my context? Is the war in Russia, between Russia and Ukraine, is that part of my context? Is it not? And then I saw a client and they're in Dubai. So is that part of my context? Where does context start and finish? And where is the heat in the system? So sometimes I think it's very useful to have not just a conversation where I'm asking the client, tell me more about your context and the heat that might be in the context, but also just noticing how macro or micro that context is. And then to inquire across those boundaries. So if they're talking just very broadly around the organization and the country and, you know, whatever's happening in the politics of the world at this point in time, to inquire about micro context. And if my context is very micro, to inquire about the macro context. We know that there are people right now that are struggling with things like, I don't always know exactly what the terminology is, but there's like this climate change related type of depression that people are getting. So here I am, my world and life might be quite comfortable. And I have so much heat because I've attuned myself to what's happening in terms of species extinction and in terms of the environment, that there's a massive amount of heat there for me, so much so that my individual self system is collapsing. Where for the next person, that same thing might not even be a blip on the radar. So it's an interesting thing to work with context and to inquire about context and to notice context in a big way there. Then other things around this, as we said, if we're not bringing in reflection and different perspectives and we just have heat for the sake of heat, that's just like burning stuff up. I am just burning stuff. They might be useful, they might not be useful, but I'm creating heat for its own sake, which is a very dangerous thing. Yeah, and so I love playing with this ideas of different verbs that go with fire, right? So if we're talking about the ethics of heat, do I need to bank the fire? Do I need to stoke the fire? Do I need to feed the fire? Do I need to tend the fire? What kind of role for me as the coach supporting a person in a heat experience do I need to take here? What's happening to the fire? And therefore, what is my role? It's not always to just throw more fuel on it. There might be lots of subtle ways in which we need to work. So one or two last things that I want to share, and then we're in the conversation. So sometimes people say it sounds much easier to bring heat in group settings. Well, in group settings, I think the heat is more collective and shared, and therefore sometimes more distributed. So you can maybe bring more heat if it's a safe group to work with than in the individual setting, where the support structure is not necessarily distributed in that experience in the same way. So we've shared a lot of these ideas of how to bring heat in coaching, including some other ones like silence, but I can evaluate the heat in the system already and how I'm responding to it and bring some different thoughts into it. I can work through heat out there. So that's what people sometimes do in coaching. They bring the heat that's out there into coaching or into supervision, and then they make some, some choices and bring some different ideas in to help them navigate and work with the heat out there. The core thing here to check is like, are we just like sharing the heat like as a form of self-validation, or are we doing something with the heat? So what's the verb that then goes with it? I've worked with clients where they go, and this 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 and that, and there's no point where we stop and go, okay, so how do you feel about how you are in this heat experience? I love the idea of giving clients the agency to design their own experiments, to be what Nick Petrie calls heat-seeking leaders. So if I, in my assessment as a leader with my coach, go, okay, maybe part of the stuckness is because there's not enough heat in the system, or the heat that's in the system has been there for a while. So I've grown accustomed to it. Then the question is, what do I want to do to introduce new heat? And that can be very practical things like I am going to ask someone else to lead the next team meeting instead of leading it myself, so giving up control. Or it could be to go and do a holotropic breathwork session because that's so far out of my comfort zone and I'm choosing it. I'm designing my own experiments, and then I'm bringing my learning from that back into the coaching. Imaginal or visualized heat is quite an interesting one. And I don't think that we work with it enough. I'll come back to that now. Working in the here and now, what's happening in the room, in the coaching relationship, that brings quite a lot of heat. And then you can bring different somatic practices either to energize or to calm down in response to that. Now, the imaginal or the visualized ways of manufacturing heat is, and because in our brains, we fire up a lot of the same neural pathways when we ask people to imagine doing something than when they're doing it for real. So I can go, imagine that you are in your next team meeting and you're doing things different in the way that we have, and you can do a proper visualization exercise around that and then come back into the process. And that's a wonderful way of doing safe experimentation, creating heat in a way that doesn't feel as far out there. So for the leader that's already got a lot of heat in their system and they know they want a little bit more heat, but they don't want it too much, you don't want to push them too far, then work with the visualized versions of working with what they want to try out in the coaching session first, because then when they actually do it, it's no longer a first-time experience. And when it's no longer a first-time experience, there's not as much heat as there was before. Yeah. And you can also, I mean, even in something like mediation in coaching, have two people that are really stuck in their conversation with each other, and they're stuck and they're stuck and they're stuck, and you go, okay, let's just stop for a moment. I want you both to imagine that in the room next door, there are two different people, not the two of you, and they're dealing with a very similar challenge. And they have tried to solve this many, many times, but they can't seem to. If you had to give those other two people advice on how to get out of your stuckness, what would you do? And all of a sudden I'm giving myself advice, and I'm in the elevated sense making of my own experience, heat experience. So I've brought that in, as opposed to just in the heat. So visualization, imaginal work, I think definitely underrated in terms of what we sometimes do in coaching. Okay, so let's hear some thoughts. Yeah, let's hear some thoughts. What's stirring for you? What are you thinking about? What possibilities are opening up for you here? What heat might you want to embrace in your own practice? Think
Maybe
about, yeah, Henriette?
Okay, I'm new to this. I do not have a practice. I'm in the corporate environment. A few years back, we did through work with Aephoria. It was almost like a year-long thing, a week, a month.
Yes.
I didn't even know that was a heat experience they were putting us through. You know, we did the dancing, the flower arrangements, all kinds of weird things that corporate people would not be doing. What I did find interesting during those sessions, because it was very, with very high level managers, and I don't know whether the Enneagram types had maybe something to do with it, because there was a lot of 8s there. And there was almost like a competitive streak that started happening. You know, with like the flower arrangements. It's like my flower arrangements is better than yours. And you know, so for me that was quite interesting. So there was never that. Yes, there was a lot of debriefing done after the sessions, which I think which was very useful. And I think it all depended where each one's individual maturity level was at. Yeah, but I think the majority of people actually enjoyed it. They actually enjoyed it.
And if you think of yourself, Henriette, if you think of yourself through this multiple heat experiences with the reflection and everything that happened there, now that you have a language for what you experienced, what do you think some of the impact of that was on you as a leader in terms of your own maturation journey? Because that's the core theory around this, is like, we do this not just because we're doing it to help people to grow and expand. What was your own experience of the impact of the heat over time?
I think, even though at the time I didn't realize why we're doing things, because I don't think at the time it was explained. But I think as a leader, it has made me much more self-aware. And I am a type 8. So, and I can be a quite forceful 8, and sometimes we forget about others. But I think the whole experience has made me calmer and actually listen more to others' experience and be open-minded to all kinds of things. I don't think you give up your own core values or your beliefs. You are open-minded to others. Yeah.
Lovely. Lovely.
Yeah.
Thanks for the share from inside that
Yeah,
kind
on
of
the other side
heat
of the fence.
experience. Yes, absolutely. So just to think about heat experiences then from a leadership perspective as well. If I am a leader and part of my task is to work on things like succession planning and to grow and develop my staff, then part of the conversation that I can have with myself and with my people is, what kind of heat experiences, and sometimes the corporate language for this would be stretch experiences. What kind of stretch experiences would be appropriate? What would stretch someone too far into nervous breakdown? What would be just the right kind of heat experience or stretch experience? Because if I'm doing succession planning and I'm not stretching people, then I'm going to get to that weird point where, you know, people are leaving and need to be replaced, and then I go, but people aren't ready. And so it's to think about how to design in some way that kind of stretch into what I'm doing for people, to help them to develop not just into new roles, but also as the context changes. And we know how much business in some contexts have changed. Wendy.
Hi, Lucille. I'm just curious. It's more a question that I have. What's your experience been with team coaching, where the team has gone through a heat experience and they now understand themselves better in terms of, you know, they're more self-aware of what they do, and there's debriefing and all of these wonderful things. But then afterwards, they just default to their behavior.
Yeah. So different thoughts. So this actually happens quite a lot. And so then the question would be, first, did we bring sufficient colliding perspectives, you know, so that different ways of doing this into conversation? Did we have all three of those balls? So that's my first thought. Have we had all three of these balls? Then the second thing is, in terms of the nature of the heat experience, was it the right heat experience? So there's this really cool guy that I met recently. He's Finnish. His name is Anssi Balk, and he's doing vertical development work in Finland. And what he does is he has these, I think there's 12, maybe 16 can't remember exactly, meta competencies that support maturation. And what he would do with his initial assessment in working with a team or with an individual would be to hone in on which of these 16 meta competencies would be the best starting point for this person or for this group. So it's to think about the nature of the heat experience. So that's the second thing. Is there a way in which the right meta competency, or, you know, did we in fact need, let's put this, I'm just going to pop this back on the screen. This is a way of thinking about it together. Did we do games where we should have done simulations, or did we do role plays where we should have done expeditions? You know, was the right level of heat there? Was it the right kind of processing? Yeah. And then the third thing is, I've manufactured heat. Is there enough heat in the system, natural heat, that creates the business case for change in the first place? So if the heat is just manufactured, but we actually quite in our groove, and someone out there has an idea that we've got a problem, but we're not so sure, then that might also be part of the work, is then around, why are we even doing this? Why does it matter to us? And then the last thought would be, and this is the same as when we work with kind of altered states as individuals, right? So if I work with holotropic breathwork or with something like a mushroom journey for myself in support of my own development, what that altered state in the moment does is it creates elasticity. It shows me what is possible at a different level of consciousness, different action logic, if we're talking in a team setting. And then when that experience is over, I go back to my life and my world and my work. And I might be able to take some of those insights with me, but it hasn't changed necessarily my state of consciousness in the everyday life. So the core then is, this is showing me a different possibility, but is one heat experience going to cut it? And Henriette already said, look, you guys took us on some crazy 5 days at a time, year-long journey. There's a lot of research that shows that if you want to support that kind of vertical shift and you're just doing one heat experience, it's not enough. You actually need at least, so 6-month programs give you shifts within a stage. 9-month and longer programs start giving you stage change. And then there's 2 other conditions that come with it. The one is, if you just work with the collective and not with the individual, you get less results. If you just work with the individual and not the collective, you get less results. If you want individual coaching and group coaching optimally, now this is not a great thing to hear if you're managing budgets, but you know, that's what the research shows. And then the other thing is, if I'm only challenging people's heat experiences